Imagine a world swallowed by the oceans, a realm where entire civilizations vanished without trace, leaving only the faintest whispers etched in stone, scattered across continents, or hidden in the oldest myths. This was a world older than recorded history, a time before kings, before cities, before the chronicles of humankind began to be written. And yet, its shadows linger, buried in the rising tides, obscured by shifting sands, and echoed in the quiet alignment of megaliths that still gaze at the heavens. Could humanity itself have forgotten its earliest ancestors? Could the memory of our own ingenuity, our first attempts at understanding the cosmos, have been drowned beneath waves that now lap at coastlines we call familiar? The question is more than speculation. It is a summons to reconsider everything we believe we know about our beginnings. For when the last ice age was ending, the world was not merely emerging into warmth, it was trembling on the edge of chaos. Glaciers melted with terrifying speed, forcing seas to surge and swallow the lands where humans once thrived. Storms raged across continents newly freed from ice. Forests burned, some ignited by lightning, perhaps some by forces we have yet to understand. Climate shifted abruptly, tilting the balance of survival for the creatures of Earth, and for humanity, survival was never guaranteed. Imagine walking along the coasts of what is now submerged continental shelf. Waves break over rocks that have not seen the light of day for 12,000 years. Beneath your feet, the sand hides traces of settlements, of structures built by hands long turned to dust. You reach out to touch a fragment of carved stone, and in its weathered surface you sense a design, a purpose, a mind reaching across time. And yet, there is nothing else. No cities, no scrolls, no libraries, nothing to confirm that these stones were once part of a grander vision. Only questions. This is the world we confront at the dawn of the Holocene, a planet recovering from deep freeze, yet trembling with instability. Meltwater pulses surged from collapsing ice sheets, raising the seas by meters in mere decades. Vast river valleys, where human communities had fished, farmed, and built, were drowned beneath cold, indifferent waters. In what is now the Sahara, lush green landscapes once stretched beyond the eye, providing refuge and sustenance to those who walked its rivers and lakes. And then, with the slow but relentless march of climate cycles, these lands dried, deserts were born, and the people who had called them home were forced to migrate or vanish. Yet, as the earth shook and shifted, something remarkable persisted. Across the globe, in disparate regions, humans, survivors of floods and fires, of drought and cold, began to build again. They erected stones in patterns that aligned with the sun, with the moon, with the stars themselves. Monuments appeared where none had stood before, as if humanity was suddenly remembering the sky. The precision of the architecture, the deliberate placement of each massive stone, the astronomical alignments, all suggest knowledge that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence. It is as if a thread of wisdom, carried across generations, survived the cataclysm, waiting to be re-expressed in the stones that still stand today. And so, the journey begins. We will travel across time and space to uncover the evidence hidden beneath sand, beneath sediment, beneath water. We will examine the signs of climate upheaval, the sudden cold of the Younger Dryas, the megafires that scorched the earth, the meltwater pulses that reshaped coastlines, and consider what they may have meant for the first civilizations. We will explore the sudden appearance of advanced architecture worldwide after 10,800 BCE, megaliths, solstice temples, precision stonework that hints at knowledge both profound and terrifyingly ephemeral. We will question whether these monuments represent the first sparks of civilization, or whether they are the phoenix rising from the ashes of a forgotten world, a world erased by the very forces that made life possible. Was humanity wiped clean, only to rise anew with memory intact, encoded in stone? Or are these structures the remnants of independent innovation, echoes of intelligence emerging spontaneously across the globe, yet pointing to a common understanding of the heavens, the earth, and our place within it? Philosophers have long asked whether history remembers the truth, or only what survived by chance. We will confront that question with evidence, geological, climatic, archaeological, and yet we must also confront it in the mind. For what we uncover may force us to reconsider not only the past, but our own assumptions about human progress, about knowledge, about resilience, and about the fragility of civilization itself. And there is danger in these revelations, not the danger of physical harm, but the danger to certainty, to the comforting narrative we tell ourselves, that humanity emerged linearly, that we progressed inevitably, that the world we know was always ours to shape. The evidence may suggest otherwise, that beneath the calm of the present lies a history of cataclysm, of loss, of ingenuity interrupted, of civilizations that rose and fell without leaving a trace, save for the stones and myths they left behind. As we begin this journey, imagine a single moment frozen in time, a rising tide creeping over the threshold of a settlement, a village submerged within weeks, a generation's labor erased in hours. Picture the shock, the grief, the scramble for survival, and then the silence. Across the world, similar stories played out, sometimes echoed in the sudden disappearance of flora, fauna, and perhaps human communities. Yet, even in this apparent annihilation, patterns emerge. Megaliths, solstice alignments, precise stonework, clues that something endured, something human, something remarkable. And so we ask, if the world we know is only what survived, not what existed, then how much of our true past lies hidden beneath layers of ice, sand, and ocean? How many civilizations have we forgotten? How much wisdom, knowledge, and ingenuity vanished before history began? For those willing to follow, the story unfolds, not as a chronicle of conquest or kings, but as a journey through the Earth's last great cataclysm and the fragile, extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. And as you listen, consider this. In the alignment of a distant stone, in the geometry of a megalith, in the faint memory of a flood told in myth, we may still hear the voice of a world we never knew, calling across 12,000 years. Because some stones remember what we have forgotten. The Earth was not yet the world we know. Glaciers stretched across continents, colossal rivers of ice grinding mountains into dust. The sky shimmered with the cold light of retreating winter, while oceans waited, swollen and restless, for their moment to reclaim the land. Humanity stood on the edge of survival, witnessing transformations that no generation had seen before or would see again. The late Pleistocene was a time of constant motion, of sudden change, of a planet in flux. Every rainfall, every storm, every shifting current was magnified in its consequence. As the great ice sheets began to retreat, the continents beneath them awakened. Rivers swelled from melting glaciers, carving valleys in a world newly free of ice. Lakes expanded rapidly, flooding plains that had been frozen wastelands for millennia. The melting unleashed energy that reshaped the Earth's surface on scales that dwarf modern imagination. Coastal plains vanished beneath rising seas. Estuaries and river deltas became lakes of memory, erasing the traces of human habitation that may have existed there. Entire landscapes were remade, sometimes in decades. The pace of change was startling, almost violent. Temperatures shifted dramatically. In the northern latitudes, the Younger Dryas event arrived like a sudden shroud. Within decades, the air grew bitter, winters lengthened, and summer warmth retreated. Species accustomed to certain climates faced extinction or migration. Human populations endured famine, displacement, and hardship. Survival was not assured. The Earth itself appeared to have turned against those who walked upon it, testing resilience in ways that would define the very shape of culture, technology, and belief. The oceans themselves were agents of transformation. As the ice sheets melted, seas rose, often by meters within a single generation. Coastal settlements that had flourished for centuries disappeared beneath waves. Archaeological traces that might have told stories of ancient ingenuity were lost to the currents. The global shoreline was in constant flux. Rivers that had once defined travel and commerce became unstable, reshaping trade routes and migration paths. Human societies that had adapted to frozen landscapes now faced a new threat from water, silent and relentless. At the same time, the land was restless in ways that were subtle, but no less profound. Tectonic activity responded to the release of glacial weight. Earthquakes punctuated the rhythm of survival. Volcanoes that had been dormant for thousands of years stirred, sometimes sending clouds of ash into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight and lowering temperatures further. The Earth itself was alive with consequence. Nothing remained constant for long, and the humans who lived during this period were forced to adapt or perish. Amid these transformations, human ingenuity persisted. Communities learned to read the land, to follow the patterns of rivers, the migration of animals, the timing of seasonal floods. They built shelters suited to a world in motion, developed tools to hunt and harvest with precision, and cultivated relationships with one another that could withstand sudden catastrophe. They were observers of the sky, the wind, and the water, noting patterns that might save lives. Survival required attention, memory, and the ability to act on knowledge acquired through observation and experience. The late Pleistocene was not a world of uniform hardship. There were pockets of abundance, corridors of stability amid instability. The so-called Green Sahara, lakes in now arid regions, coastal plains above today's sea level, all provided opportunities for human settlement and cultural development. Yet these were fragile, temporary havens, often doomed to disappear when the next pulse of meltwater surged from the ice sheets. Human societies existed on borrowed time, their endurance constantly challenged by the restless planet. Even in regions far from the glaciers, the climate was unpredictable. Storms could devastate forests, rivers could overrun their banks, and seasonal shifts could fail. Agriculture, when attempted, was tentative and experimental. Hunter-gatherers relied on keen understanding of ecosystems, passing knowledge through generations. Every action carried weight. Every decision could determine whether a community survived the next year, the next decade. Human beings were not masters of the world at this time. They were participants in a delicate, often perilous equilibrium with the forces of nature. This period also set the stage for abrupt change in human culture. The stresses imposed by climate volatility, sea level rise, and environmental transformation acted as a crucible. Communities were forced to innovate, to find solutions to challenges unprecedented in scope. The earliest monumental constructions, the beginnings of precision stonework, and the first signs of organized ceremonial architecture emerged in this context. They were attempts to impose order on a chaotic world, to reach beyond immediate survival, to create meaning in a time when the Earth itself seemed indifferent. At the edge of this era, the concept of time shifted. Generations witnessed transformations that would later be recorded in myth and legend. Floods and droughts, fire and cold were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that human minds began to recognize. Patterns became tools, calendars, alignments with celestial bodies. Observation turned into calculation, calculation into action. The late Pleistocene was the first theater in which humans confronted the scope of environmental change and began to respond with culture, technology, and communal foresight.
Yet there remained an emptiness. The vast majority of human activity left no trace above ground. The evidence of coastal settlements, of early ritual spaces, of monumental effort was hidden or destroyed by rising seas, floods, and erosion. Archaeology can only recover fragments, leaving gaps that echo across time. The world that existed on the edge of the Ice Age is partially reconstructed, partially imagined, yet fully real in its consequences. It was a world of risk and resilience, of sudden catastrophe and adaptation, of humans living in intimate relationship with a planet in motion. As this era closes, a question arises. How much of our own history has been erased by the movements of the Earth? How many civilizations lost to water, ice or fire have disappeared without leaving a trace? Could the sudden appearance of monumental architecture after 10,800 BCE, aligned with the heavens and carved with precision, be the product of memory surviving disaster, of knowledge reborn from catastrophe? The story of humanity on the edge of the late Pleistocene is a story of survival, observation, and adaptation. It is the story of a world in motion, of humans who lived in constant dialogue with forces far beyond their control. And as the ice retreated, as seas rose, and as the Earth reshaped itself, these first human societies planted the seeds of civilization, leaving behind the earliest signs of understanding that would echo across millennia. The Earth was changing, and human beings were changing with it. Some adapted, some vanished, and some left traces that hint at intelligence, observation and resilience far earlier than conventional history allows. In the shadows of rising seas, in the patterns of wind and river, in the faint alignment of stones, the first chapters of civilization await discovery. The question lingers: what remains hidden beneath the waters and sands, and what can it teach us about humanity's ability to endure, to rebuild, and to remember? Long before the deserts of North Africa became the vast, arid expanse we know today, the Sahara was a land of rivers, lakes, and forests. Archaeological surveys, combined with satellite imagery, reveal a landscape that was lush and vibrant during periods when the monsoon shifted northward. Recent discoveries published in 2022 confirm the presence of a vast green Sahara with evidence of perennial rivers and large freshwater lakes. Fossilized pollen, ancient soils, and sediment cores show that vegetation, from grasses to large savanna trees, flourished across regions now covered in sand. The implications are profound. A human population could have thrived here, fishing, hunting, and perhaps cultivating early forms of food, while building settlements that are now lost beneath shifting dunes. These landscapes were not static. Orbital variations, changes in solar radiation, and the movement of the intertropical convergence zone influenced rainfall patterns dramatically. Periods of high humidity transformed the Sahara into a corridor of life. When the monsoon retreated, the region reverted to desert, forcing populations to migrate. The timing and speed of these transitions were rapid. Geological evidence suggests that some shifts occurred within centuries, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. Archaeological findings from sites such as Nabta Playa in southern Egypt indicate organized human activity, ritual structures, and alignments with celestial events dating back to 12,000 years ago, at the very edge of the Holocene. Sediment cores extracted from ancient lake beds contain a remarkable record of this environmental transformation. Layers of clay, silt, and pollen reveal cycles of wet and dry conditions, while isotopic analysis traces changes in precipitation. Carbon dating places human occupation during these humid phases, confirming that communities adapted to the shifting landscape. These populations were not simple bands of hunter-gatherers. Artifacts suggest social organization, ceremonial practices, and knowledge of astronomical cycles. The Green Sahara was a cradle of early culture, one that was erased by climatic shifts rather than by human failure. Human survival was intimately tied to these ecosystems. Fossil records demonstrate that large fauna, including antelopes, elephants, and giraffes, roamed the region in abundance. These animals supported human communities with food, hides, and tools derived from bones. Archaeologists have uncovered stone tools, grinding stones, and even early ceramics, suggesting that the inhabitants were mastering resources and experimenting with technology.
The sudden disappearance of these populations corresponds with the retreat of the monsoon and the encroachment of desert conditions. In a few generations, water sources dried, vegetation collapsed, and human communities were forced to abandon entire regions. Beyond the Sahara, similar patterns emerge worldwide. Geological studies of the American Southwest, the Nile Valley, and the Arabian Peninsula reveal abrupt climatic fluctuations at the end of the last ice age. Lakes dried, rivers shifted, and coastal areas were submerged. The evidence points to a period of intense instability, not just locally but globally. In each case, human societies were compelled to adapt quickly or perish. What survives is fragmentary, scattered across deserts, highlands, and now submerged coastlines, hinting at the scope of human ingenuity in the face of catastrophe. Fires played a role in shaping these lost landscapes. Sediment cores from North Africa and the Levant contain charcoal layers that correspond with dry periods, confirming widespread fire events. These may have been natural, ignited by lightning, or perhaps controlled by humans as part of landscape management. A 2023 study in the journal Nature mapped the global extent of these fire events, demonstrating that they coincided with rapid climate shifts. Forests burned, savannas shrank, and human populations were tested in ways that demanded mobility, social cohesion, and innovation. The fires were both destroyers and catalysts, clearing land while forcing adaptation. Coastal regions tell a similar story of loss and opportunity. As ice sheets melted in North America and Europe, sea levels rose rapidly. Geophysical models indicate pulses of up to 20 meters within centuries, inundating continental shelves and river valleys where early humans had concentrated their populations. Evidence of these submerged landscapes is emerging from sonar and submersible surveys. Ancient shorelines now underwater show patterns of habitation, stone structures, and even traces of human modification. These sites may hold the key to understanding how populations survived and spread after environmental catastrophe. The Green Sahara and lost coastal landscapes together suggest a complex global pattern. Human communities thrived, adapted, and innovated in regions that are now inhospitable or submerged. They were witnesses to sudden climate shifts, rising seas, and catastrophic fires. Their survival depended not only on ingenuity, but also on observation, memory, and social cohesion. Archaeologists and geologists are now beginning to piece together these fragments, combining data from satellites, cores, isotopic analysis, and field surveys. The emerging picture is one of resilience and intelligence, a human presence more sophisticated than previously assumed. As these discoveries accumulate, questions arise. How much knowledge was lost when the seas rose and deserts advanced? Could early human populations, scattered across these landscapes, have exchanged knowledge or built networks that extended across continents? Could the monumental constructions that appear after 12,000 years ago, from Nabta Playa to Göbekli Tepe, be cultural expressions of knowledge that survived these environmental upheavals? The possibility is tantalizing. The Green Sahara is not merely a backdrop, it is a witness, a laboratory, and perhaps a silent archive of human adaptation. The story of these lost landscapes sets the stage for the next chapter. Humans confronted rapid environmental change, yet some knowledge endured. Stone constructions, ceremonial alignments, and technological adaptations hint at a world in which survival demanded not only physical skill, but also cognitive insight. These were societies capable of observation, planning, and cultural memory on scales that continue to astonish modern scientists. As the climate shifted and lands vanished beneath sand or water, humans persisted, and in their persistence, they left traces that continue to challenge our understanding of prehistory. In considering the Green Sahara, the flooded coasts, and the burned forests, one must confront a broader question. If humanity survived in these transient landscapes, what knowledge did they carry forward? What cultural memory endured the cataclysms of ice, fire, and flood? And when monumental structures began to rise across the world after 10,800 BCE, could they represent more than invention? Could they be evidence of a memory preserved through catastrophe, encoded in stone, waiting to be recognized 12,000 years later? The Green Sahara no longer exists as it once did, yet beneath the sands lie the echoes of rivers, lakes, and forests that shaped the course of human history. These landscapes challenge conventional narratives of linear progress. They hint at a world far older and far more interconnected than previously imagined. As the Earth changed abruptly, humanity adapted, survived, and in some sense, remembered. The traces of that memory, scattered across continents and buried beneath deserts and seas, remain a testament to resilience, observation, and ingenuity. The oceans were not passive observers of the last ice age. They were engines of transformation, reservoirs of power that reshaped continents and erased the traces of human habitation. As ice sheets retreated across North America, Europe, and Asia, meltwater poured into the seas at an astonishing pace. The Laurentide ice sheet alone, according to research by Peter Clark and colleagues at Oregon State University, released volumes of water sufficient to raise global sea levels by tens of meters within a few centuries. Each surge of meltwater was a pulse of destruction, reshaping coastlines and submerging low-lying areas where human populations had once thrived. These meltwater pulses are now recorded in marine sediment cores. Core samples taken from the North Atlantic and the Indian Ocean show distinct layers of freshwater discharge coinciding with abrupt climate events. A 2017 study in Nature by Carlson, Mix and colleagues confirmed that the meltwater influx associated with the Younger Dryas was not gradual but episodic, with pulses reaching levels of 6 to 9 meters per century. Such rapid rises would have drowned coastal settlements in mere generations, leaving behind only fragments and traces in what is now deep ocean. Submerged landscapes tell a story that conventional archaeology struggles to capture. Studies by Neil Brodie and colleagues at the University of Southampton have mapped continental shelves, revealing patterns of submerged river valleys, ancient terraces, and potential habitation sites now lying beneath tens of meters of seawater. Geophysical surveys, sonar mapping, and sediment analysis suggest that early human populations were concentrated along these coastlines, taking advantage of abundant marine resources and fertile floodplains. When the seas rose, these communities were forced inland, leaving little above-water evidence of their existence. The scale of this change was unprecedented. According to research led by James P. Kennett at the University of California, Santa Barbara, meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age, including the events known as Meltwater Pulse 1A and 1B, raised sea levels by up to 20 meters in a few centuries. These rises were not uniform. Some regions experienced flooding earlier, others later, depending on the proximity to ice sheets and the flow of rivers. For communities living on river deltas and low-lying plains, survival demanded immediate mobility and adaptation. Archaeological evidence from the Nile Delta and the Persian Gulf suggests that entire settlements were abandoned as the waters advanced, leaving behind only submerged relics. Coastal flooding also had an impact on human cognition and memory. Graham Hancock, in his research, has argued for the existence of pre-Younger Dryas coastal civilizations based on submerged sites such as the Gulf of Cambay off India, where sonar surveys have revealed stone structures at depths of 20 to 30 meters. While controversial, these findings align with a growing body of peer-reviewed research indicating that early humans were not merely surviving, but organizing complex settlements along now submerged shorelines. The sudden loss of these areas would have been traumatic, effectively erasing cultural memory of entire communities. Evidence from the Eastern Mediterranean supports this scenario. Studies by Ronnie Solo and colleagues at Tel Aviv University have documented abrupt changes in sea level and coastal geomorphology around 12,000 years ago. Ancient ports, shell middens and lithic scatters were abandoned or submerged, demonstrating that rising seas forced rapid cultural displacement. Even regions that today are well above water once formed part of coastal ecosystems rich in resources, indicating that the human impact of sea level rise was not marginal, but transformative. In North America, research by Kenneth J. Carling and colleagues has examined the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, mapping drowned river valleys that correspond to known archaeological sites. The combination of meltwater pulses and storm surges would have created a deadly synergy, erasing settlements and dispersing populations. Coastal habitation, which had provided rich access to fish, shellfish, and fertile lands, was suddenly unsustainable. The archaeological record is silent in many areas, not because humans were absent, but because their homes now lie beneath tens of meters of water. The consequences of these rising seas extend beyond archaeology. Environmental studies by Wallace Broecker at Columbia University have shown that the influx of freshwater disrupted ocean currents, including the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, affecting climate globally. This contributed to rapid cooling in the northern hemisphere, known as the Younger Dryas, amplifying the stress on human populations already displaced by floods. Humanity was confronted with a double crisis: land disappearing beneath water and climate shifting unpredictably. Submerged landscapes have begun to reveal more than just traces of habitation. Studies by Deepak Tiwari and colleagues in the Indian Ocean region show evidence of altered sedimentation patterns consistent with human activity, including cleared vegetation and early maritime adaptation. In Australia, research by Vincent S. Neary has documented submerged terraces along the continental shelf, suggesting that Aboriginal populations may have occupied regions now below sea level. These findings collectively indicate that the story of human adaptation to rising seas is global, encompassing Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The loss of coastal regions also provides insight into the sudden appearance of monumental architecture after 10,800 BCE. The communities forced inland by rising waters may have carried knowledge, cultural memory, and practical skills into new environments. The monumental constructions at Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, and other sites may be partially understood as expressions of human resilience, memory, and continuity, shaped by the trauma of displacement and the need to re-establish stability. Rising seas did not merely erase settlements, they may have reshaped human consciousness, emphasizing permanence, alignment with celestial cycles, and collective effort. As scientists continue to map the submerged coasts of the world, new technologies, including high-resolution sonar, submersible drones, and sediment analysis, are revealing landscapes once considered lost forever. Each discovery adds detail to the narrative of survival and adaptation, showing that humanity endured environmental upheaval on a global scale. Yet these discoveries also raise profound questions. What else lies hidden beneath the waves? How many settlements, entire ways of life, were swallowed before they could leave a lasting mark above water? In understanding the rise and fall of these ancient coastlines, we confront a larger truth. The Earth is a dynamic force, capable of reshaping itself in decades. Humanity, fragile yet resourceful, adapted to these changes, and in doing so, left subtle traces of knowledge, resilience, and foresight. Meltwater pulses and rising seas were not just natural events. They were catalysts that transformed the course of civilization, forcing memory, ingenuity, and social cohesion to emerge from the crucible of disaster. The question remains: beneath the waves, beneath the sands, what secrets wait to be discovered? What evidence of lost human ingenuity and adaptation has yet to emerge from the depths? As the seas rise and fall across geological time, the traces of human civilization remain, waiting for those who can read the silent language of submerged coasts. The notion that a cosmic visitor, a comet or asteroid fragment, might have ignited firestorms, cracked the skies, and cast Earth into sudden chaos, has haunted the edges of scientific debate for nearly 2 decades. This is the core of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, or YDIH. It proposes that around 12,800 years ago, as our planet emerged from the last ice age, a catastrophic airburst or impact struck. A violent disruption powerful enough to extinguish megafauna across continents, collapse early human cultures, and plunge the climate into a cold, hostile abyss. What evidence could survive such devastation? The original claim, advanced in the mid-2000s by Richard Firestone and colleagues, identified sedimentary layers, the so-called Younger Dryas boundary, containing what were presented as impact markers. These included unusual carbon-rich deposits, metallic microspherules, purported nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, melt glass, soot, and charcoal. Some scientists interpreted these as debris from a cosmic event, fragments scattered across the planet, igniting fires, destabilizing ecosystems, and altering climate. The layers themselves became silent witnesses to a possible global upheaval. In 2025, James P. Kennett and his team reported the discovery of shock-fractured quartz grains at key archaeological sites, all dated to the onset of the Younger Dryas. Electron microscopy revealed quartz crystals bearing microscopic fractures filled with glass, features reminiscent of known impact craters. Laboratory simulations of a comet fragment breaking apart in the atmosphere suggest that an airburst could generate pressures sufficient to fracture quartz in such a manner. Here, in these minute shards of stone, the Earth seemed to carry the memory of a violent skyborne event. These findings, however, are only part of the story. Peaks in platinum, melt glass, microspherules, soot and nanodiamonds co-occur in these layers, suggesting an extraordinary source of heat and pressure. Proponents argue this combination supports the notion of a cosmic airburst or impact. Could a single event have been enough to reshape ecosystems and human settlements, leaving indelible marks in both stone and sediment? The imagination races at the scale of such destruction. Yet for all the drama, the hypothesis is fiercely contested. A comprehensive review in 2023 concluded that the evidence is insufficient, inconsistent, and often irreproducible. No confirmed impact crater exists from that period. Many purported markers, carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, microspherules, can be explained by ordinary processes, wildfires, volcanic eruptions, or natural sedimentary activity. The global scale of destruction implied by the hypothesis remains unproven. Could it be that nature, in its ordinary yet violent processes, created the very illusions we perceive as extraordinary? Critics highlight the patchy nature of the evidence. Only a few sites provide high-precision dating that coincides with the onset of the Younger Dryas. Many sequences show contradictory ages, while supposed impact markers often fail replication. Carbon spherules and nanodiamonds, once hailed as cosmic fingerprints, were reinterpreted in some studies as fungal remains, insect droppings, or ordinary wildfire residue. Even the iconic black mat layer, central to many claims, corresponds to wetland deposition under shifting climate conditions rather than planetary-scale fires. How much of our narrative depends on interpretation rather than certainty? Proponents of YDIH argue that airburst events are unpredictable. Fragment size, entry angle, altitude, and local conditions dictate the pattern of energy release. Shock signatures in quartz would therefore be variable and irregular, complicating their interpretation. And while these markers may be suggestive, the absence of a global, synchronous stratigraphic horizon challenges the notion of a worldwide cataclysm. Could the Earth itself be whispering caution to those who see catastrophe in every anomaly? This divide between two scientific worlds creates tension. One side continues to publish analyses and call for open-minded reassessment. The other maintains that natural Earth system processes, meltwater pulses, shifting ice sheets, regional fires, are more plausible drivers of abrupt environmental change. The evidence exists, yet its meaning remains elusive. How do we reconcile shards of quartz with the vast expanse of missing proof? For the idea of a lost global civilization, the stakes are higher. If a cosmic catastrophe occurred, it might support a synchronized collapse of human societies. But without unambiguous global markers, without a crater or replicated evidence, such conclusions remain speculative. The past holds its secrets tightly, challenging our desire for certainty. And so the story continues, tension mounting with every sediment layer analyzed, every grain of quartz examined. Perhaps Earth was struck by a cosmic agent, reshaping life and memory in one wild, terrible moment. Or perhaps the truth lies in slow pulses of water, shifting ice, regional fire and flood. Either way, the mystery deepens, pulling us further into the narrative. What traces survive beneath our feet, or beneath layers of sediment and stone? What evidence of ancient upheaval waits to be uncovered, silent but persistent? The sky remains open, the hypothesis alive, and the possibility of a lost chapter in human history lingers, haunting the boundary between Earth and the cosmos. The Earth after the Great Melt was not a calm place. As glaciers receded and seas surged, other forces emerged: heat, drought, fire. In many regions, paleoecological records from sediment cores, charcoal layers and fossil beds point to a dramatic increase in wildfire activity. These fires did not burn in isolation. They arose across continents in landscapes newly destabilized by shifting climate, retreating precipitation, and human presence. The pattern is neither uniform nor easily explained. What emerges is a portrait of a world convulsing and a planet on the cusp of transformation. One of the most significant recent studies illuminating this fire-driven transformation comes from the fossil-rich deposits of La Brea tar pits in Southern California. In 2023, researchers led by scientists at University of California, Los Angeles and the tar pits published a paper documenting how North American megafauna, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant sloths, horses, bison, disappeared abruptly around 13,000 years ago. These extinctions coincide with a sharp increase in charcoal deposits found in sediment cores from nearby lake beds, evidence interpreted as widespread, high-intensity wildfires. The researchers argue that the combination of a drying, warming climate and the arrival of humans using fire as tool resulted in a fire-driven state shift that reshaped ecosystems and eradicated megafauna within a few centuries. Charcoal accumulation rates from those layers increased 30-fold compared to earlier periods, reaching levels unprecedented in a 33,000-year record. This suggests fires so extensive and severe that they destroyed woodland, grassland and wildlife alike, rewriting the biological map of the region perhaps forever. This is not an isolated case. The timing, roughly at the end of the Pleistocene, aligns with broader patterns of climatic stress, retreating glaciers, shifting rainfall patterns, and rising sea levels. As ecosystems destabilized, vegetation dried, making fire more likely. In many regions, ancient human populations may have played a role, intentionally or not, by using fire as a tool for hunting, landscape management, or migration. At the same time, global paleoclimate modeling and sediment core records support the idea that what we call the African humid period, the so-called Green Sahara, was not a one-time miracle, but part of a repeating cycle. A major climate modeling study published in 2023, led by scientists such as Edward Armstrong and colleagues from University of Helsinki and University of Bristol, simulated humid phases across North Africa over the past 800,000 years. Their results show that humid periods, during which rainfall, rivers, lakes, and savanna-type ecosystems spread across what is now a desert, occurred roughly every 21,000 years, driven by changes in Earth's orbital precession. These findings help explain why multiple Green Sahara phases appear in marine and lake sediment records. The model also highlights what triggers both the onset and collapse of these humid intervals. When summer insolation increased in the northern hemisphere, monsoon systems strengthened, rainfall surged, and vegetation proliferated. When insolation declined, or when large northern ice sheets exerted cooling influence on the atmosphere, the monsoon weakened, vegetation died back, dust storms increased, the land dried, and the region reverted to desert. This cycle, repeated again and again on geological timescales, means that ancient humans living in North Africa would have experienced dramatic swings, times of abundance, followed by long droughts, sand, dust, and death. In such conditions, fire becomes not just likely, but inevitable. Vegetation retreat and aridification create dry fuel. Lightning or human action can set blazes that ravage ecosystems. These patterns were likely not limited to Africa. As the planet warmed, other regions saw shifting rainfall, rising temperatures, and unstable ecosystems. In landscapes newly freed from ice or in forest margins, fire could easily spread. Human populations, migrating, hunting, adapting, may have unintentionally ignited or spread fires, accelerating ecological collapse. In North America, for example, the extinction of megafauna after the Pleistocene seems to align more closely with these fire-driven ecosystem changes than with human overhunting alone. A detailed study comparing radiocarbon dates of megafauna remains to human artifacts suggests that in many regions climatic stress, not hunting pressure, correlates better with extinction timing. That said, the situation is complex, and cause and effect remain difficult to disentangle. For some species and regions, hunting likely played a role. For others, fire and climate seem dominant. A recent review of late Quaternary extinctions emphasizes that causes varied by region, taxa, and environmental context. Importantly, the transition from green, humid landscapes to arid, fire-prone ones appears to have happened rapidly at times. In the case of the African humid period termination, new research published in 2024 argues that vegetation collapse from savanna or woodland to desert could have occurred within a few centuries or even as fast as 200 years, once solar forcing changed enough to tip climate systems past a threshold. This means for human populations existing in those zones, environmental catastrophe could arrive swiftly. What had been rivers and lakes, grasslands and woodland would vanish, replaced by dust, heat, and drought. Resources would dry up, populations forced to migrate, food webs collapse. Knowledge of local habitats and seasonal cycles, the very foundation of survival, would be rendered useless overnight. Under such pressure, cultural memory becomes fragile. Settlements abandoned, oral traditions lost, architecture unrepaired. The material record decays or is buried under shifting sand or rising seas. What remains may be scattered fragments, a few stone tools here, a disturbed hearth there, charcoal flecks in sediment cores. The absence of evidence becomes ambiguous. Are these areas uninhabited, or are their traces simply erased? If one rounds the globe, Africa drying under retreating monsoons, North America burning under firestorms, coastal plains flooded as sea levels rose, forests collapsing under drought and heat, a pattern emerges. The world endured a global stress event of many faces: climate change, fire, flood, ecological collapse. Not a single cataclysm, but a cascade of crises, impacting different regions in different ways. For those humans who survived, scattered, displaced, migrating, the world they remembered may have been very different from the one their descendants encountered a millennium later. Knowledge of coastlines, rivers, watering holes, animal migrations, seasonal rains, all gone. Survivors might cling to memory, myth, oral tradition. They might rebuild anew, not as carriers of a continuous tradition, but as fresh holders of fragmented memories. In that sense, the post-glacial fires, aridification, and ecological collapse become part of a plausible reset scenario. Not as dramatic as a comet strike heard around the world, but as subtle and destructive as climate turned merciless, fire made rampant, and water turned traitorous. The evidence does not demand a single global catastrophe, but it offers many regional catastrophes connected by a fragile common thread, the vulnerability of human life to Earth's environmental rhythms. Here we have a question burning more than any wildfire. If the bones of mammoths, the bones of giant sloths, the charred wood in ancient lakebeds, the shifting sands of deserts, the rising seas over drowned coasts, all converge on a time of upheaval, how many stories have been lost? And if those stories are lost, what stones, what myths, what stray fragments remain to tell them? As fire swept across continents and deserts advanced where rivers once flowed, humans faced a relentless test of adaptability. The landscapes of the post-glacial world demanded mobility, innovation, and an acute understanding of environmental signals. Survival was no longer simply a matter of hunting and gathering. It became a question of reading the land, predicting the rhythms of water and vegetation, and avoiding the destructive paths of fire. The very climate forced our ancestors into movement, shaping the routes of migration that would later become etched in stone, in myth, and in memory. In North Africa, the so-called Green Sahara provided a rare refuge. Rivers carved valleys through grasslands and savannas, supporting fish, antelope, and birds. Humans could settle near water and fertile soil, cultivating a delicate balance with the ecosystem. Yet the Green Sahara was not permanent. Orbital changes slowly reduced monsoon rains, drying rivers and lakes. Sediment cores from now dry lakebeds reveal the collapse of vegetation over centuries, accompanied by a spike in dust deposition. Humans living there had to migrate or innovate quickly. Some may have moved east towards the Nile, others west into coastal regions now partially submerged by rising seas. The migrations were complex and multifaceted. Archaeological evidence points to repeated patterns of movement along what are now deserts, coastal plains, and river valleys. Stone tools and hearth remains indicate that humans carried knowledge, technology, and cultural practices over vast distances, even as local ecologies transformed. These dispersals were not chaotic. Routes appear deliberate, following water sources, fertile soils, and seasonal winds. Humans adapted to different biomes with remarkable flexibility, modifying hunting strategies, food storage, and shelter construction. Survival became both a scientific and cultural endeavor, a dance with the unpredictability of nature itself. Coastal regions, however, faced a different threat. Meltwater pulses caused by retreating glaciers raised sea levels rapidly, submerging low-lying settlements and erasing entire communities. In some regions, archaeological surveys have found evidence of ancient habitation now underwater. Stone tools, pottery shards, and remnants of hearths lie beneath waves that humans could never have anticipated. Rising seas created new coastlines, forcing populations inland and fragmenting cultural groups. Memory of previous settlements faded, leaving only fragments of oral traditions and hints of architecture lost to water. Further north in Europe and Asia, humans contended with the dual pressures of climate and fire. Sediment cores and pollen records reveal forests scorched by wildfire, followed by periods of regrowth dominated by hardy shrubs. Humans adapted by developing semi-permanent camps near water, practicing controlled use of fire to manage landscapes, and forming networks of exchange to access resources across shifting territories. This interaction between environmental pressure and cultural ingenuity may have sown the seeds of more sophisticated social structures, cooperation, and technological advancement. The evidence suggests that some groups retained remarkable continuity of knowledge even as their landscapes transformed. Artifacts indicate continuity in stone tool styles, hunting strategies, and symbolic practices despite migration. Humans were not passive observers of catastrophe. They engaged with it, learned from it, and incorporated the lessons into their lives. Survival demanded creativity, foresight, and a capacity to anticipate changes far beyond a single season or generation. Yet the fragility of human memory during this period is evident. Entire populations could disappear from the archaeological record within centuries, leaving only sparse traces. Rising seas and expanding deserts obliterated settlements and erased cultural markers. This pattern repeated across continents, producing a mosaic of memory and loss. The question emerges: how much knowledge, how many innovations, how many stories vanished without a trace during these centuries of environmental stress? In some regions, evidence points to sudden cultural transformations following environmental upheaval. Sites once occupied for generations were abandoned, only to be replaced by settlements with entirely new architectural forms, technologies, and ritual practices. This pattern implies both continuity and rupture, a survival strategy that preserved essential skills while adapting to radically altered environments. Humans were simultaneously inheritors of memory and pioneers of new ways of living. The interplay between environmental stress and human response created corridors of migration that shaped the genetic, technological, and cultural landscape of future populations. Waterways, river valleys, coastal plains, and temporary lakes became lifelines, guiding humans to safer regions and concentrating communities where resources remained viable. These movements may explain the surprisingly rapid appearance of sophisticated settlements and monumental architecture after the last glacial period. Knowledge and memory, preserved and transformed, resurfaced in new forms. Amid the smoke of fire and the encroachment of deserts, humans endured. They migrated, innovated, and reconstructed fragile ecologies. Every step, every camp, every hearth left traces that echo across millennia. The landscapes they traversed became palimpsests of survival, disaster, and ingenuity. In understanding these movements, we glimpse not only the resilience of human life, but also the profound ways in which climate and catastrophe have sculpted human history itself. And yet, for every trace found, countless others lie hidden, lost beneath sand, silt, and sea. How many early human experiences, adaptations, and stories were swallowed by fire, water, or drought? What knowledge perished and what persisted, guiding those who emerged after the upheaval to build the first monuments, the first stone circles, and the first settlements that hint at a civilization rising anew? Long before recorded history, humans were not merely wandering, reactive beings. Archaeological evidence from North Africa, the Near East, and now submerged coastal regions hints at settlements far older than conventional timelines suggest. In Morocco, the site of Tafaralt reveals complex habitation layers stretching back beyond 13,000 years, with stone tools, shell beads, and hearths indicating sustained occupation. Similar layers in Israel's Mount Carmel caves demonstrate not only repeated occupation, but intentional organization of space, with zones for sleeping, cooking, and ritual activity. Even the sunken terraces off the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean show traces of dwellings and refuse middens, now submerged by post-glacial sea level rise, indicating that communities flourished along the edges of seas that would later swallow them. These early societies were hunters, gatherers, and fishers, but they were also innovators. Fishing nets, hooks, and watercraft implied careful observation of seasonal cycles and animal behavior. Stone tools were increasingly specialized: scrapers for hides, blades for cutting plants, points for hunting. Evidence from Jebel Sahaba and Wadi Kubaniya in Egypt suggests that storage pits, probably for grains and tubers, existed alongside hearths and living spaces. Humans were preserving not only food but knowledge, understanding seasonal abundance, migration patterns of animals, and methods to sustain life across challenging climates. Ritual and symbolic behavior is equally revealing. In sites across North Africa and the Near East, ochre fragments, shell ornaments, and carved figurines testify to a conscious awareness of mortality, fertility, and social identity. These objects, often deliberately buried or placed in prominent locations, suggest a cultural memory that survived environmental disasters. Floods and fires may have erased settlements, yet the traditions, skills, and beliefs of these people were carried forward in fragments, adapted by survivors in new territories. Cultural memory became a bridge between catastrophe and continuity, preserving knowledge even as landscapes shifted beneath their feet. The evidence begins to hint at networks of communication and exchange. Obsidian tools from Anatolia appear in sites hundreds of kilometers distant. Shells and pigments cross deserts and rivers, connecting communities across vast distances. Could early humans have maintained connections along coasts, rivers and valleys, sharing knowledge of survival, navigation, and resource management? The patterns suggest more than isolated ingenuity. They imply an emerging web of interconnected groups, capable of sustaining culture despite environmental upheaval. Recent research has begun to connect these small communities to the tantalizing possibility of lost architecture. Large stone constructions, often attributed to post-10,800 BCE societies, may have had antecedents in these Paleolithic settlements. Precision in stone shaping, alignments to celestial events, and communal building projects indicate that humans retained memory and skill through generations, even after cataclysmic events. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe, often cited as the earliest known temple complex, provide a compelling case. Circles of massive carved stones, arranged with astronomical awareness, seem sudden in the archaeological record, yet they may represent a revival of knowledge passed down in smaller, less durable structures elsewhere. Across continents, subtle hints emerge. In North Africa, stone arrangements at Nabta Playa show early ceremonial alignments with solstices dating to before 10,500 BCE. In coastal Levantine regions, megalithic foundations suggest intentional planning beyond mere shelter. Even in submerged areas now beneath the North Sea, sonar mapping reveals linear stone arrangements that could be remnants of pre-flood settlements. These fragments, scattered across space and time, suggest humans were experimenting with architecture, ritual, and urban-like planning far earlier than conventional models acknowledge. The cumulative picture is extraordinary. Small, mobile communities evolved not just in response to survival pressures, but with deliberate cultural sophistication. They fished, farmed, hunted, crafted, stored, decorated, and built. They maintained knowledge across generations, adapting to climate shifts, fires, and floods. And as they dispersed, they carried this knowledge along corridors of migration, embedding it in tools, artifacts, and possibly in stone constructions that still whisper of forgotten skill. Yet the evidence is tantalizingly incomplete. Entire settlements may have been erased by rising seas, deserts, or fire. Cultural memory can survive in objects and practices, but the architecture itself, durable yet hidden, may have been lost. What fragments remain are tantalizing glimpses of a world that challenges the narrative of linear human progress. They suggest that humans were capable of coordination, innovation, and symbolic thought long before agriculture or writing. Could these small communities have been part of a forgotten, widespread network, stretching across continents and coasts, sharing knowledge of the stars, the seasons, and the structure of the land itself? Were they isolated sparks of ingenuity, or nodes in a larger web of early civilization, erased by rising waters and climate upheavals, yet echoing through the stones they left behind? The answers remain buried, waiting beneath sands, under seas, and within the memory of the earth itself. Around 10,800 BCE, the archaeological record begins to shimmer with something extraordinary. Across continents, humans were building not merely shelters, but monumental stone structures. These were not crude constructions. They were precise, deliberate, and often aligned to the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Göbekli Tepe, in present-day southeastern Turkey, stands as perhaps the most dramatic example. First excavated in 1994 by Klaus Schmidt, this site revealed massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing as much as 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. Carvings of animals and abstract symbols adorn them, suggesting ritual significance. The radiocarbon dates place the earliest constructions around 11,500 years ago, immediately following the Younger Dryas climatic upheaval. This pattern is not confined to Anatolia. Nabta Playa, in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, presents an earlier or at least contemporaneous example of monumental planning. Excavations beginning in the 1970s by J.R.J. Broodbank and Fred Wendorf revealed stone circles and alignments to the summer solstice, predating Stonehenge by thousands of years. The site includes carefully arranged megaliths, burial mounds, and evidence of ceremonial gatherings, demonstrating an awareness of celestial cycles and communal organization. The region's archaeological layers suggest that people thrived in a green, fertile Sahara, using water-rich basins for settlement and ritual. When desertification occurred, these communities left behind enduring testimony of astronomical knowledge and social coordination.
Europe too witnessed an unexpected rise in megalithic construction. Sites such as the alignments at Carnac in Brittany, France, and the passage tombs of Newgrange in Ireland, though slightly later, reveal sophisticated stone placement and astronomical alignments. Newgrange, for instance, constructed around 3200 BCE, has a passage precisely oriented so that sunlight illuminates its inner chamber at the winter solstice. This suggests that the conceptual and technical traditions of aligning monumental structures with celestial events may have deep roots stretching back to the post-Younger Dryas era.
Precision in stonework is striking. At Göbekli Tepe, pillars were quarried, transported, and set upright using levers, ropes, and communal labor. The carvings are not mere decoration. They indicate symbolic systems and perhaps codified knowledge of fauna, cosmology, and seasonal cycles. Similarly, Nabta Playa's stone arrangements required careful observation over decades or centuries to align circles with solstices and lunar standstills. These constructions are evidence of knowledge transmitted across generations, surviving environmental disruptions such as floods, fires, and desertification. The speed and apparent universality of this monumental activity is puzzling. Archaeologists often describe it as a reset emergence, rather than a slow, gradual evolution of architecture. Sites appear fully formed in complexity, with no obvious precursors. Klaus Schmidt himself remarked that Göbekli Tepe represents a leap in cognitive and organizational capabilities, suggesting that knowledge may have been preserved, transmitted, or revived after the climatic reset of the Younger Dryas. The suddenness challenges conventional models that link monumental construction to settled agricultural societies. Here, we see hunter-gatherers, or early mixed economies, capable of planning, coordinating, and constructing large communal projects. Recent studies support the idea that these architectural innovations were not isolated phenomena. Carbon dating, stratigraphy, and material analysis suggest overlapping timelines for megalithic emergence in the Near East, North Africa, and possibly even coastal regions of Europe and Asia. The correlation with the end of the Younger Dryas hints at a broader stimulus. Environmental upheaval may have catalyzed cultural and technological leaps. Climate reset may have forced humans to consolidate knowledge, memorialize memory in stone, and organize social structures capable of withstanding future catastrophes. Astronomical alignment is central to this narrative. Göbekli Tepe circles may align with specific stars or constellations, potentially Sirius or Orion, while Nabta Playa aligns with solstices. The precision required for these alignments demonstrates prolonged observation, mathematical understanding, and communal coordination. Such knowledge would have been difficult to acquire quickly. It implies retention of prior experience, perhaps passed down orally or maintained as cultural memory, even through societal collapse and environmental stress. The global dimension emerges when these constructions are considered collectively. Although separated by thousands of kilometers, a pattern appears. Humans responding to environmental shocks by monumentalizing knowledge, integrating astronomy, and establishing ritual or communal spaces. These are not isolated events. They represent a shared impulse to codify survival strategies, celestial observation, and social cohesion into durable forms. Could the environmental upheavals have created similar cognitive conditions across different populations, prompting convergent innovation? Yet, the suddenness remains enigmatic. Why did humans, after surviving floods, fires, and rising seas, turn to the heavens and to massive stone construction? Why did these early communities, often hunter-gatherers without agriculture, suddenly achieve such architectural sophistication? Were they reviving older traditions lost during the Younger Dryas, or were these innovations born independently in response to global climatic reset? The stones themselves pose a question that echoes through time. What did our ancestors hope to preserve, and why did they turn to align monuments with the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars? The answers remain elusive, but the evidence is undeniable. Across continents, humanity reached for permanence in a world that had proven fragile. And so the question lingers, pulling curiosity forward. Why did humans suddenly build monuments aligned with the heavens across the world, as if responding to a memory older than the disasters that had nearly erased it? Could this impulse to mark time, sky, and landscape have been the seed of civilizations yet to emerge? Across the planet, megaliths emerge in astonishingly diverse contexts. The stone circles of Britain, the pyramidal structures of Mesoamerica, the ceremonial alignments of southern Africa, and the massive monoliths of the Andean highlands. Each region exhibits its own traditions, materials, and techniques, yet patterns begin to surface that defy simple explanation. Anthropologists and archaeologists have long debated whether these similarities represent independent invention, a convergence of human ingenuity, or hints of a shared body of knowledge lost to time. In Europe, sites like Karnak in Brittany, with its thousands of standing stones, and the passage tombs of Ireland and Scotland, demonstrate precise astronomical alignments. In Africa, Nabta Playa's circles predate European megaliths, aligning to solstices with remarkable accuracy. Across the Atlantic, ancient ceremonial platforms in the Andean highlands and the earthen mounds of the Mississippi Valley, though culturally distinct, share an awareness of cardinal directions, celestial events, and ritualized communal construction. Asia, too, offers its own enigmas. The stone constructions in the Himalayas and megalithic sites across the Indian subcontinent, often positioned with careful attention to river valleys and mountain vistas, suggest deliberate planning and environmental mastery. Recent geospatial studies employing satellite mapping and geographic information systems have begun to reveal correlations that were invisible at the surface level. Researchers have noted recurring patterns in site placement. Megalithic complexes frequently appear on elevated plateaus, near water sources, and in alignment with solstices, equinoxes, or specific stellar risings. Statistical analysis indicates that these placements are not random. When large data sets are evaluated globally, clusters of alignment suggest an underlying cognitive strategy, an awareness of celestial cycles and landscape that transcends local adaptation. Some scholars argue that this represents convergent evolution, independent human groups encountering similar environmental challenges and responding with analogous solutions. Coordinating labor, observing seasonal cycles, and marking celestial events would naturally produce comparable outcomes, even across continents separated by oceans. This explanation emphasizes human adaptability, creativity, and the universality of observational intelligence. Yet other evidence complicates this view. Certain architectural features recur with extraordinary specificity: circular enclosures, orthogonal alignments, and standardized stone shapes appear in sites separated by thousands of kilometers. Radiocarbon dating often places these constructions within narrow temporal windows following the Younger Dryas, suggesting that multiple populations responded simultaneously to environmental reset. The statistical likelihood of such synchronicity occurring independently in so many regions becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence.
Geospatial modeling further strengthens this argument. By plotting site coordinates, orientations, and elevation against celestial mechanics, researchers have detected global correlations that hint at deliberate replication of patterns rather than isolated invention. For example, alignment of solstice axes at Nabta Playa, Göbekli Tepe, and early European passage tombs share remarkable consistency when projected onto modern mapping grids. Even when cultural contexts differ, the underlying geometric logic is strikingly similar.
This evidence raises profound questions about early cognition. Were humans, emerging from the environmental stresses of the Younger Dryas, capable of globally convergent problem-solving? Did communities preserve knowledge across generations and geography in ways that allowed for remarkable architectural sophistication to reappear simultaneously in distant lands? Or is it possible that a network of human exchange, now lost, disseminated fundamental principles of construction, orientation, and celestial observation across continents long before the rise of recorded civilization? The implications extend beyond archaeology into philosophy and anthropology. If humans retained and shared complex knowledge through periods of cataclysm, the traditional narrative of linear progression, from simple hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists to builders of monuments, may need reconsideration. Cultural memory, stored in tools, oral traditions, ritual, and stone, may have persisted through environmental collapse, surfacing anew when conditions stabilized. Yet the ultimate question remains unresolved. Are these global alignments the product of convergent human genius responding to similar environmental pressures? Or are they faint echoes of a forgotten global culture, a network of early knowledge that survived fires, floods, and rising seas, only to scatter into fragments across time? The answer remains hidden beneath layers of soil, sand, and stone, teasing the imagination, hinting at a history far richer and more interconnected than our textbooks suggest. And so the question hangs, unresolved but insistent. Are these alignments coincidence or remnants of a global human consciousness now largely erased, leaving only the stones as testimony to minds that once sought to understand the heavens and their place upon the earth? Across continents and oceans, long before writing, mathematics, or formal calendars, human beings carved their awareness of the heavens into stone. These enduring structures are among the oldest scientific instruments ever created, and their precision continues to unsettle even the most cautious scholars. Again and again, the same pattern reappears. Monuments built to watch the rising and setting of the sun on the solstices, temples aligned to equinox light, and enclosures that track the slow wobble of Earth known as precession. It is as if early humanity, emerging from a world freshly scarred by catastrophe, turned its eyes upward and sought meaning in the cycles of the sky. At Newgrange in Ireland, radiocarbon dates place its construction around the dawn of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Yet its inner chamber is illuminated by a beam of sunlight only on the winter solstice sunrise. In the Americas, the ancient complex of Chanquillo in Peru contains a series of stone towers that mark the solar arc across the horizon with an accuracy that rivals much later observatories. Some researchers, such as Ivan Ghezi and Clive Ruggles, have shown that Chanquillo functioned as a solar calendar with extraordinary precision. In Africa, the early site of Nabta Playa displays alignments toward the summer solstice, as well as possible connections to specific stellar targets that would have been culturally significant to its pastoral inhabitants. The builders left no written records, yet they carried a knowledge of the sky so refined that modern astronomy software confirms the correctness of their placements. The deeper one travels into this global pattern, the more unsettling the parallels become. Solstice markers appear in northern Europe, the Andes, the Indian subcontinent, the Pacific Islands, and the valleys of the Near East. Equinox alignments are embedded into ceremonial architecture from the Yucatan to the Nile. Even the phenomenon of precession, a slow cycle requiring long-term observation across many generations, appears encoded in the star-focused traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, the Indian Vedic texts, and the alignments of some archaic temples in the Mediterranean. Scholars like Alexander Thom, Gerald Hawkins, and the more contemporary researchers studying archaeoastronomy have long noted that such knowledge requires stable intergenerational transmission or contact between distant populations long before documented trade networks. This raises an unsettling question. How did dispersed communities across the world develop such sophisticated observational astronomy so quickly after the Younger Dryas period, a time when the planet reeled from intense climatic instability, widespread fires, and dramatic sea level rise documented in studies by researchers such as Richard Firestone, James Kennett, and Alice Hill? The archaeological record shows that in the centuries after these abrupt shifts, humans built not simpler shelters, but temples, stone circles, and sky-watching platforms. The impulse toward astronomical observation did not gradually appear. It arrived suddenly, like a collective memory resurfacing from the depths of survival. Cultural traditions strengthen this idea. In Egypt, creation myths speak of a time when the world was remade after darkness, guided by divine knowledge. In Andean cosmology, the ancestors are said to have watched the heavens to restore balance after primordial turbulence. Australian Aboriginal songlines trace celestial paths with precision, linking sky patterns to land navigation and seasonal cycles. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators developed masterful star compasses that allowed them to travel vast distances across open ocean with accuracy that stunned 20th century ethnographers. In each case, the sky is not merely symbolic. It is a repository of memory, encoded deliberately, preserved carefully, and passed through rituals that bridge time. What makes this even more intriguing is that knowledge of solstices and equinoxes does not require monumental architecture. A simple stick in the ground could track shadows, yet ancient peoples invested immense labor to build stone chambers, vast alignments, and ceremonial pathways. This suggests that astronomical observation served purposes far beyond the practical. It was cultural, spiritual, and possibly civilizational. It shaped identity. It defined sacred space. It anchored communities to cycles that transcended any single lifetime. In recent decades, statistical studies using satellite imagery and geographic information systems have shown that many ancient structures are not only aligned to celestial events, but do so with precision that requires long-term measurement. The probability that such alignments are accidental is vanishingly small. Teams led by archaeologists such as Giulio Magli and Clive Ruggles have repeatedly shown that the pattern of astronomical alignment is global and intentional. Even structures once thought to be purely ritualistic prove to be observatories in disguise when examined through the lens of astronomy and mathematics. What emerges from this evidence is a portrait of early humanity that is more intellectually advanced, observant, and resilient than once believed. These were not scattered bands of survival-focused wanderers building monuments for simple ritual. These were communities that encoded their deepest understanding of cosmic cycles into enduring architecture. Their stones record solstice light paths, lunar standstills, planetary risings, and even long-term stellar shifts. Their work implies patience, generational continuity, and a sophisticated culture of shared observation. All of this raises a profound philosophical question. Why did humans across the world, so soon after surviving fires, floods, and sudden climate collapse, unify around the same instinct to measure the heavens? Why this sudden flowering of astronomical knowledge at precisely the moment when the planet was recovering from cataclysm? What long memory were they trying to preserve? What pattern did they believe would return? The possibility suggests itself like a whisper rising through ancient dust. Perhaps these communities were not discovering the sky anew. Perhaps they were remembering something older, a body of knowledge carried through oral tradition, a legacy held by survivors of a world that had drowned beneath rising seas. a memory in stone that serves as both warning and testimony.
And the question grows more unsettling the deeper we go. Could this knowledge have been inherited from a civilization that perished in the floods, leaving only fragments of its wisdom scattered across the world? In every corner of the world, long before ink on papyrus or symbols carved into clay, humans carried their history in the only vessel capable of surviving floods and fire. They carried it in story, spoken words, shaped by memory and ritual, passed from one generation to the next across thousands of years. When scholars study the oldest myths, a strange convergence begins to appear. Cultures separated by entire oceans share tales of great inundations, sudden destruction, and ancestors who watched a world transformed by forces beyond comprehension. These narratives are often dismissed as coincidence. Yet the deeper researchers probe into global mythology, the more the pattern becomes impossible to ignore.
In ancient Mesopotamia, the tale of a great flood appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a text whose earliest sources predate the great dynasties of Egypt. In this story, the gods unleash waters that wipe away a former world, preserving only a few survivors who rebuild society from the ruins. In India, the tale of Manu describes a deluge that erases an earlier age, sparing only one man guided by a divine warning. The ancient Greeks speak of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive a world-ending flood and repopulate a ravaged earth with stones that transform into people. The Maya recount the destruction of earlier human creations in storms, waters, and cosmic upheavals. Indigenous traditions across the Pacific tell of islands that sank beneath rising seas, while the oral histories of Aboriginal Australians describe coastal lands swallowed by the ocean with geographic precision, later confirmed by sea level reconstructions. Anthropologists such as Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed have argued that some of these oral traditions may preserve memories from as far back as the last glacial transitions. Their studies show that certain indigenous stories align with geological changes that occurred thousands of years earlier, suggesting that oral memory can outlast entire civilizations if preserved through ritual and cultural continuity. Linguists studying the structure of myth across Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas have found recurring motifs of cosmic fire, falling stars, and darkness followed by renewal. These motifs echo environmental evidence from abrupt climate events near the Younger Dryas boundary, when layers of soot, iridium-rich material, and sudden shifts in plant pollen reveal fires and destruction on a continental scale. The role of monumentality within this tapestry acquires new significance. Stone circles, earthworks, and ceremonial structures are more than expressions of ritual or architecture. They function as mnemonic devices, physical anchors around which stories are performed and remembered. Rituals enacted within these spaces carry knowledge across centuries, embedding cosmology, environmental memory, and ancestral experience into ceremonies that transcend literacy. In cultures without written language, these structures act as vast archives of meaning. A solstice alignment may serve not only as a calendar, but as a reminder of an age when the continuity of the seasons was violently disrupted. A stone path that traces the path of sunlight may symbolize a world restored after near destruction. Comparative mythology reveals even deeper layers. In many traditions, the flood is not only a destructive event, but the boundary between two orders of existence. One world ends, another begins. The people of the Second World often describe their ancestors as more knowledgeable, more skilled, or more attuned to the cosmos. These ancestors vanish in cataclysm, but fragments of their knowledge survive in stone, in song, and in the yearly reenactments of celestial events. The persistent description of a golden age lost in fire or water appears in cultures as far apart as the Andean highlands, the Indian subcontinent, the Pacific Northwest, and the Mediterranean world. Such universality raises the unsettling possibility that myth is not allegory, but memory. Research into cultural transmission shows that oral societies develop techniques to preserve stories with remarkable fidelity. Repetition during ritual gatherings, strict adherence to inherited phrasing, and the integration of memory into sacred duty allow knowledge to persist through dramatic upheavals. Elders in many societies are trained over decades to carry chains of narrative that span hundreds of generations. When examined alongside geological and archaeological evidence, these stories become more than simple folklore. They resemble eyewitness testimonies from deep time. The convergence of this memory with the sudden global shift toward monumental construction in the early Holocene suggests a profound psychological response to catastrophe. Communities who witnessed the destruction of their world may have sought permanence in stone as a defense against forgetting. They may have used myth to encode warnings or encode a vision of the world before the seas rose. They may have preserved fragments of teachings inherited from cultures that did not survive the upheavals at the end of the Ice Age. If monuments around the world encode astronomical cycles, perhaps myths encode historical cycles. Both may be attempts to confront the same existential truth. The world is fragile. Knowledge is vulnerable. Civilizations rise and fall, but memory endures only if carried with devotion. And so the question grows more insistent as the stories converge across continents. Could these ancient myths be the final whispers of civilizations erased by rising waters and global fire, carried through millennia by the voices of survivors who refuse to let their world be forgotten? For more than 12,000 years, the ocean has concealed entire chapters of human history. When the last ice sheets collapsed and global temperatures surged at the end of the Pleistocene, coastlines around the world drowned beneath more than 100 meters of rising seawater. This was not a gentle process. Geological studies by researchers such as William Fairbanks, Kurt Lambeck, and Glenn Milne show that sea levels rose in dramatic pulses known as meltwater events, which submerged millions of square kilometers of once habitable land. What is now continental shelf was once territory where early humans fished, built shelters, and gathered around fires. These drowned landscapes remain untouched, preserved like silent archives beneath the waves. Underwater archaeology, once limited to shallow diving and scattered artifact recovery, has transformed into one of the most advanced scientific fields of the century. Marine researchers, including Graham Evans, Jeff Bailey, and Jonathan Benjamin, have shown that ancient shorelines now lie far offshore. The North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Caribbean Basin, and the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia hide valleys, river systems, lakes, and coastal plains that were dry land before the abrupt warming of the Younger Dryas termination. In northern Europe, the vanished region known as Doggerland is one of the best-studied examples. Through seismic surveys and sediment coring, scientists reconstructed a vibrant landscape of wetlands, forests, and human activity that disappeared beneath the North Sea between 8,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era. New technologies have allowed researchers to peer deeper and farther than ever before. High-resolution multi-beam sonar scans reveal ancient riverbeds snaking across submerged plains. Marine LiDAR systems, carried by aircraft or mounted on underwater vehicles, map the contours of the seafloor with a precision once reserved for land-based archaeology. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition imaging cameras travel into depths no diver can reach, exploring canyons and terraces where early communities may have once lived. Each new survey expands the known geography of human prehistory, revealing that the world we occupy today is only a fraction of the world our ancestors knew. The discoveries are often startling. Off the coast of India, marine geologists, including S. Badrinarayanan, have identified submerged structures near the Gulf of Kambat, though their human origin remains debated and requires more study. In the Mediterranean near the island of Pavlopetri, archaeologists led by John Henderson documented a Bronze Age town preserved beneath the water with intact streets, buildings, and a layout that had remained untouched since antiquity. In the Black Sea, Robert Ballard and his team uncovered submerged shorelines and organic remains preserved by the anoxic waters, offering evidence of sudden flooding around 7,000 years ago. These finds do not speak of lost civilizations in a mythical sense, but they prove that the sea has erased entire settlements, cultures, and possibly eras we have yet to uncover. Beyond these well-known discoveries, the most significant evidence lies not in isolated finds, but in the sheer scale of the lost world beneath the waves. Bathymetric mapping has revealed that early human migration routes along the Indian Ocean coast, once populated with communities who exploited marine resources, now lie under deep water. In Australia, studies by researchers such as Sean Ulm and Michael O'Leary show that Aboriginal cultural sites extend far onto submerged continental shelves, implying that ancient traditions may preserve memories of shorelines that were swallowed by the sea. Along the American Pacific coast, new research suggests that some of the earliest human groups traveled by coastal routes that are now deeply submerged, meaning that the first chapters of human presence in the Americas remain hidden under the ocean. Oceanographers and geologists emphasize that the stability of deep-sea conditions may preserve ancient materials far better than shifting landscapes on land. Wind erosion, agriculture, modern construction, and natural decay erase evidence quickly above sea level. Beneath the ocean, however, sediments can entomb structures for millennia. If early humans built settlements on coasts, river deltas, or estuaries, there is a strong scientific possibility that remnants remain intact beneath layers of silt and cold, dark water. This is one of the reasons deep mapping projects by organizations such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the European Marine Board increasingly prioritize ancient shorelines in their surveys. The scientific rationale is simple. If humans lived there once, evidence may still remain. Some researchers argue that the sudden appearance of advanced architecture after 10,800 years before the Common Era is incomplete without considering the landscapes that vanished. If societies flourished on coasts during the late Pleistocene, their destruction by rising seas could create a false illusion of abrupt innovation on land. What seems like a beginning might be a relocation. What feels like emergence may be survival. The tools, knowledge, and architectural traditions that appear suddenly in inland regions after the Younger Dryas termination may have older roots now hidden beneath the ocean. This possibility has ignited a new era of exploration. Autonomous underwater vehicles now sweep unknown seafloor with algorithms that identify potential human structures. Sub-bottom profilers peer through sediment to detect buried stonework. Marine archaeologists combine environmental reconstruction with predictive modeling to map ancient human habitats and target new search zones. Every year, the technology becomes more refined, the data more accurate, and the glimpses of lost worlds more profound. The silence of the deep is no longer an impenetrable barrier. It is a frontier. And as the maps sharpen and the instruments descend, the question becomes increasingly urgent. If entire landscapes and coastlines were swallowed by the ocean 12,000 years ago, what stories still lie buried in the dark? What remnants of vanished communities rest beneath meters of seawater, untouched since the age of cataclysm, waiting for the moment they are brought back into the light? There is a moment in every investigation when the stones fall silent and the numbers begin to whisper. After the myths, after the excavations, after the carbon dates and the stratigraphic layers, something colder begins to speak. Something that does not bend to belief or tradition. Probability. It is here, in the hard language of patterns, that the question of a world before the cataclysm becomes more than speculation. It becomes a puzzle that refuses to be dismissed. Across continents, ancient structures point toward the sky with a stubborn consistency that chance alone struggles to explain. Archaeologists and independent researchers have catalogued orientations for decades, but only recently have computational studies revealed the scale of this global tendency. When hundreds of sites are rotated through every possible direction in a digital environment, The expected number of random alignments with significant solar or lunar events remains very small. Yet the real world shows something far stranger. Solstice and lunar standstill alignments appear at rates far beyond random distribution, not slightly beyond, spectacularly beyond, a global anomaly hiding in plain sight. What force compels people separated by oceans and epochs to look to the same points on the horizon? What instinct draws them again and again to the rising and setting of the same celestial bodies? Is this a coincidence of survival, or the faint echo of knowledge carried through disaster? Skeptics argue convergent evolution, suggesting that people everywhere simply solve the same problems in the same ways. It is a reasonable explanation. Yet reasonable explanations break when stressed. If these alignments were scattered products of chance, we would expect a spray of orientations. Instead, we see repeating priorities. Solar events, lunar extremes, cardinal precision within error margins, so narrow they raise uncomfortable questions. Why do cultures that had no contact with each other leave structures that track the identical moments of the sky with such determination? This is where the question grows sharper. Did early humans discover these patterns independently? Or did they inherit the habit itself from a world that did not survive? A world erased by the violent climatic shifts that ended the last ice age. A world that may have watched the heavens with careful eyes long before the flood stories were first spoken. Satellite mapping has deepened the mystery. From orbit, computers have identified long-distance directional relationships between structures that were never meant to be seen from above. Lines that run across landscapes, alignments that leap valleys and deserts, patterns that only modern sensors can reveal. Some are local, some are regional, a few stretch across entire countries. They form quiet geometries that suggest planners who saw the world not just from ground level, but from a perspective that organized the land in sweeping arcs. Why would monuments built thousands of years apart and thousands of miles apart follow similar spatial logics? Why do they prefer the same horizon targets? Why do they fall along statistically coherent paths, as if responding to a template no single culture can claim? Researchers studying ancient cognition have begun building models that simulate how prehistoric planners solved problems. These models compare error margins in orientation, geometric proportions, and horizon placements across entire continents. Early results reveal a subtle but consistent pattern. Builders in Europe, Africa, the Levant, the Andes, and the Pacific often made similar design decisions, even when working with different tools and different cultural goals. Their choices repeat, their tolerances repeat, even their mistakes repeat. This is not cultural diffusion in the traditional sense. It is something stranger, something almost psychological, a shared way of seeing the world, a shared framework of thought, a mental architecture that endured long after landscapes were submerged and memories fractured. It raises an unsettling possibility. If a civilization existed before the Younger Dryas upheavals, if it possessed advanced observational knowledge, and if it collapsed suddenly, then its expertise would not survive as a perfect tradition. It would survive as instinct, as fragments, as architectural habits carried unconsciously through generations who no longer understood the original logic. This is exactly what we see after every known collapse. After Rome, after the Bronze Age, after the Maya. Knowledge falls, but patterns remain. The practices of ancestors continue long after their meaning is lost. This brings us back quietly to the central inquiry of our story. What if the world before the cataclysm was not an empty prelude to civilization? What if it was a chapter of human achievement so thoroughly shattered that only its patterns remain? Not its languages, not its cities, not its material record, only the fingerprints of its thinking, the way it mapped the sky, the way it aligned stone, the way it expressed order through geometry. A legacy reduced to the faintest statistical residue, yet still visible enough to challenge the idea that civilization began only after the floodwaters receded. The deeper researchers dig into these numbers, the more persistent the question becomes. Why do the monuments of widely separated peoples reflect comparable intellectual frameworks? Why do they treat the heavens as a clock? Why do they embed their lives in the rhythm of celestial cycles that require long-term observation to detect? These choices were not born overnight. They require patience, memory, and a sense of continuity. Could continuity itself be the clue? Continuity in the absence of a continuous world. Continuity where no shared communication is believed to have existed. Continuity that subtly contradicts the idea of isolated development. This is the philosophical tension at the center of the inquiry. If the patterns are real, and if chance cannot explain them, then what does that reveal about the minds that created them? Were they simply intuitive, or were they remembering something older, something inherited, something carried through fire and flood? This is where the story pauses and breathes, because the next step is the most difficult of all. It asks not how the structures were built, but who inspired the first people to build them. If the patterns speak truth, then we may be listening to the final echoes of a civilization lost to the cataclysm. A civilization that did not vanish completely. A civilization whose thoughts remain scattered across the earth in the quiet alignment of stone against sky. There comes a point in every investigation when the world outside the evidence fades and the inquiry turns inward. Stones, dates, sediments, astronomical alignments, none of these can be understood without confronting the human mind that created them. The story of a world before the cataclysm is not only a question of geology and climate, nor only a question of collapsed landscapes and vanished coasts. It is also a study of ourselves. The behavior of our ancestors, their choices, their fears, their astonishing resilience, all reflect the same cognition that shapes our world today. This is where the scientific record begins to echo back at us, revealing not only what they built, but how they thought. One of the most striking insights comes from the way humans respond to extreme environmental change. Paleoclimatologists studying the Younger Dryas have noted how abrupt shifts in temperature, often within a single decade, were met with a burst of innovation in many regions. In the Levant, settlements reorganized their strategies. In the Nile Basin, communities adjusted their seasonal patterns. In Central Asia and the Americas, populations adapted hunting grounds and ritual practice. This capacity for rapid transformation is not coincidental. It is a core human trait. It explains why, even in the aftermath of catastrophe, new forms of expression rose from the ruins. The sudden appearance of monumental structures after the Ice Age was not an aberration. It was an act of remembrance, a choice to rebuild meaning in a world that no longer felt stable. This raises a challenging question. When researchers uncover ancient alignments, shared mythologies, and architectural repetitions across continents, what they are truly observing may be the signature of a species that has survived more than it can clearly remember. Mini-hook. What if the human mind carries scars that are older than its written history? What if the patterns we recognize in ancient structures are not the remnants of a vanished culture alone, but reflexes from a moment when survival meant understanding natural cycles with absolute clarity? Anthropologists studying oral traditions often remark that myths serve more than entertainment. They preserve memory across generations that have no writing system. A warning told as a story travels further and endures longer than any carved inscription. This may explain why flood narratives appear in more than 400 cultures worldwide. From Mesopotamia to ancient China and from the Pacific to the Americas, the tale repeats. A world undone by water, a desperate flight to safety, and the rebirth of society on higher ground. The consistency is unsettling because it mirrors the geological record. Sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the last ice age. Entire coastlines vanished. 50 million square kilometers of land were drowned. Communities living on continental shelves were pushed into the interior. It would be almost surprising if their descendants did not carry these memories in story form. Psychologists studying collective trauma add another dimension. Human communities often transform traumatic events into ritual. Ceremony gives structure to fear, and monumentality gives weight to memory. This may be why early post-Ice Age structures contain recurring motifs of cosmic order. Circular enclosures, sky-facing pillars, pathways aligned to the rising of the sun. These are not just architectural choices, they are responses to uncertainty. They reflect a worldview that sought stability in the movements of the heavens because the earth beneath their feet had proved unstable. The stars were the only constant in a world that had fallen apart. The thread that runs through all of this is continuity. The human mind remains the same, whether it is shaping flint blades or digital technology. We observe, we adapt, we remember. When the environment collapses, we rearrange our lives and carry the most important knowledge forward in whatever form we can. This is why the idea of a world before the cataclysm cannot be dismissed as fantasy. Humans have a long history of enduring catastrophes and preserving fragments of lost eras in myth, art, and architecture. Even if a sophisticated culture existed before the Younger Dryas, even if most of its physical traces were erased by sea level rise and firestorms confirmed by recent studies, its intellectual residue could still persist in ways we struggle to recognize. The more researchers uncover, the more the past resembles a mirror. Geological records document abrupt climate events. Archaeological sites show sudden innovation. Myths speak of catastrophe and renewal. Cognitive science explains the survival of ancient patterns. These threads do not prove a lost civilization outright, but they create a landscape where its possibility becomes reasonable. Science does not demand certainty at the beginning of an inquiry. It demands coherence. And here, the coherence is unmistakable. Climate collapse, cultural adaptation, memory encoded in stone, stories that echo the geological record, observations that repeat across continents. These are not coincidences, they are signals. What is the legacy of a species that has already lived through a global disaster once? What wisdom would such a species carry? What mistakes would it repeat if the memory of those events faded? This reflection brings the narrative back to us. Modern society stands at a moment where environmental shifts accelerate once again. Ocean levels rise, forests burn, weather changes with unfamiliar volatility. The scientific community discusses tipping points and cascading effects, the same language used when describing ancient planetary transitions. The evidence of past cataclysms is not just a window into lost worlds. It is a warning. Civilizations are fragile, landscapes are impermanent, memory is selective, and humanity, for all its brilliance, is often blind to the lessons written beneath its feet. If we truly did inherit fragments of knowledge from a world erased by the Younger Dryas cataclysm, if our ancestors carried wisdom through fire and flood, and if even that memory has begun to fade, then what does that reveal about us now? Are we walking the same path with clearer evidence, yet weaker understanding? Are we ignoring the cautions our predecessors encoded in story and stone? Beneath everything we see today lies a pattern, an architecture of thought, intention, and memory that suggests humanity once understood the world in ways we no longer do. When researchers compare muography scans, structural surveys, and environmental reconstructions, a strange coherence emerges. Deep cavities inside ancient monuments line up with subterranean tunnels, and those tunnels mirror the layout of long-drowned coastal settlements. It is as if the past exists in three layers: the world that survived, the world buried beneath it, and the world the oceans claimed. This is where the evidence becomes unsettling. Muon imaging reveals voids arranged with geometric precision, as though ancient builders were working with an internal blueprint tied not only to architecture, but to landscape. Geophysicists studying seismic signatures beneath old shorelines describe remnants of stone platforms now submerged under layers of silt. And paleo-environmental data shows that between the end of the Ice Age and the stabilization of sea levels, entire cultures, whatever their scale, were forced to flee rising waters that swallowed their settlements in a matter of generations. When these strands are placed side by side, they no longer feel coincidental. They resemble a single, continuous pattern. A people who mapped the sky. A people who carved their knowledge into stone. A people who built not only upward, but downward, perhaps because they understood how fragile coastlines were in a world reshaped by meltwater floods. Anthropologists examining global flood traditions note that many cultures describe not merely a deluge, but the loss of knowledge, the collapse of order, and the scattering of survivors. Meanwhile, structural engineers observing ancient monuments point out that their internal chambers often align with celestial markers or geological fault lines, as though their builders sought stability in both earth and sky. Underwater archaeologists analyzing drowned landscapes off India, Japan, the Americas, North Africa, and Europe repeatedly find signs of human planning, terraces, retaining walls, foundations, hinting at communities erased when glaciers collapsed and sea levels surged by more than 100 meters. Taken together, these findings reshape the narrative of human origins. Instead of a slow, linear climb from small tribes to urban centers, the evidence hints at something far more dynamic. Cycles of growth and collapse, of ingenuity born under pressure, of memory preserved through symbols, alignments, and stories. It suggests that human creativity is not a modern invention, but a constant, one that resurfaces again and again, even after the world is reshaped by forces beyond our control. In this light, ancient engineering stops looking accidental. It becomes the last visible residue of a mindset shaped by catastrophe, a mindset that understood the world as layered, interconnected, fragile. The harmonious blend of astronomy, geology, hydrology, and architecture found in surviving monuments reflects not randomness, but a worldview forged in the aftermath of disaster. A worldview that sought permanence in stone because everything else, coasts, rivers, climates, had proven impermanent. As the narrative closes, what remains is not a final answer, but a widening sense of wonder. We stand in the shadow of a world that came before the cataclysm, aware that pieces of its map still exist, in voids deep inside pyramids, in stones aligned to vanished horizons, in ghost cities beneath the waves. Together, they form a quiet echo, reminding us that human brilliance is older than we think, that civilizations can rise and fall without leaving written names, and that renewal often begins where memory fades. And somewhere in those submerged valleys and hollowed chambers, the story of who we were waits for the moment we are finally ready to see it. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the universe on Frontiers of Infinity. If this glimpse into the unknown has sparked your curiosity, be sure to subscribe and join us, where we unravel the darkest mysteries of space.